On to the speakers. Professor Salman Sayyid, the head of School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds. He is the author of Thinking Through Islamophobia and several other published works on Islamophobia. We are very, very fortunate that he will be speaking at our session. Now he'll be joined by another very, very important speaker. So, as you know, CAGE is a London-based advocacy group which aims to empower communities impacted by the war on terror. So it highlights and campaigns against state policies developed as part of the war on terror, striving for a world free from oppression and injustice. Our speaker, Dr. Asim Qureshi, who is the director of research at CAGE, is also the author of the book, I Refuse to Condemn. After the two speakers, there will be a 20-minute Q&A session. We will be addressing the questions to all of them, and please feel free to use the boards array. Can I ask then Dr. Asim Qureshi to please start the session today? Dr. Asim?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can.
Okay. Bismillah wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And jazakumullah khair to all of my hosts. I know there are many organizations, alhamdulillah, who have come together to bring this event together. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept it from you, accept it from me, and make my words ones that are of some benefit. Of course, anything that I say that is incorrect, it's only from my own mistakes and from the shaitan. So I ask you then to please forgive me if I say anything out of turn. I was pleased that you started the event with the Quran because, you know, the Quran gives us an entire schema for our life. It's not, you know, when we talk about religion, even the idea of religion is a very secular concept because it separates the notion of deen from the life that we live every single day. So when we think about deen, what we think about is an entire schema of life that makes it important for us to live in the world and to deal with the world as we are interacting with it. That could be something as simple as filling out your billable hours for your company correctly. You know, it's a righteous act. We don't give it that credence sometimes, that, you know, something so simple is actually an act of ibadah by doing it correctly, if we have that niyyah to do it that way. And so it is with the rest of the world that we live in as well, that the way that we interact with it has a consequence for our actions. And, you know, Brother Naim spoke very eloquently at the start about, you know, the potential consequence of us as bystanders being potentially complicit in a system of oppression. But of course, the important part of that complicity is not what it means in a material sense, but what it means for each and every one of us in terms of our individual akhirah. What does this mean when I'm standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So for example, with the story of Ashab as-Sabt, the people of Saturday in the Quran, you have three categories of people: the people who speak against a wrongful act, the people who do the wrongful act, and then the third category of those who remain silent. And the scholars have largely agreed that the category who remain silent are also condemned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this is something for us to think about, not to judge, but for our own personal understanding of what taqwa means, of what consciousness of Allah means in our daily lives. And that's why I just wanted to preface my remarks today with that, because I think as Muslims, when we speak to one another, especially about politics, we shouldn't be quick to just speak about politics without framing it within the relationship that we have to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if we understand ta'abbud, if we understand the worship of Allah as it should be understood, then we know that these things are connected to one another. And so I'm here today to speak about structural Islamophobia, okay? So just shifting track a little, but at the same time with that reminder in place always. And where I want to start with is in history, to say that you know, whatever we experience is nothing new. You know, going back to the Quran, we are told again and again how we will be tested like those before us were tested. You know, and there is a reason why 1/3 of the Quran is filled with stories of the past. Those stories are not there just to make us feel good or have an interesting story to read about as we're reading this book of guidance. It's actually direct guidance in our lives. And so when we think about structures of repression and repression, the Quran actually opens itself up as a guide for us. And one of the ways in which we know that is through all the different stories, whether it's Fir'aun and Musa, Ibrahim and Nimrod, and so many others, alayhim as-salam. We know that this is the case. And so we take that history and we bring it into our context, like we do with all of history. So we study the Quran, we study its histories, but we also study more contemporary history, like, for example, the histories of the Black Civil Rights struggle, or the histories of what happened in Ireland, or, you know, in any number of other circumstances where people were otherized. You know, India is another very good example of that, apartheid South Africa, where people are taken and they are made an enemy, they are made an other. And this is a very old tactic, very, very old tactic. In Surah Qasas, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the first few ayat that Fir'aun split the society into portions and then he oppressed Bani Israel, killing their children and enslaving their women. There's a predicate to the oppression taking place, which is the division of society. Fir'aun can't just oppress Bani Israel, he has to otherize them. He has to make them into a community that can be targeted by making them a minority, right? It's a predicate to the oppression. And we see this predicate again and again and again. Look at what the Serbians did to the Bosniaks during the Balkans conflict. You know, they preached this particular form of ethno-nationalist violence, which resulted ultimately in the otherizing of the Bosniaks, who were then, of course, had a genocide committed against them. So even in our contemporary life, for those of us who were born and, you know, kind of lived through and understood what was going on in Bosnia, you know, we know that this can happen. And it can happen to Muslims ostensibly who are whiter than white. You know, I've been to Bosnia myself. I'm sure many of you have as well. These are Muslims who look completely European. Like they could walk around London, you know, white skin, blue eyes, and they would pass as a native of the UK. But yet they were massacred because of their Islam. And so what we learn from this is that when it comes to structural racism, there is nothing new under the sun. There are certain practices that replicate themselves again and again and again. And what we're talking about ultimately here, in relation to how policies embed themselves, is what we call a pathology. And there'll be many doctors or medical professionals among your group, I'm sure. And you know, you'll be wondering, well, why is he using a word like pathology in relation to racism? And the reason we use this word is because when states are looking for threats, they look for superficial manifestations of otherness, right? So when Black people were being particularly targeted in the UK by stop and search powers, the pathology there was their Blackness, nothing else. That was why they were being stopped, especially with the SAS laws that we had in the 80s. Completely disproportionate number of Black people being stopped, right? Now, how does this translate within the context of the war on terror? It builds off these racist programs and policies. So it's not like 9/11 happened and all of a sudden the policies became very anti-Muslim. What happened was that there were already policies in place that had built an infrastructure of racism in society, of discrimination. And when 9/11 happened, governments, not just in the UK, but around the world, were able to build on top of those pre-existing pieces of legislation and policy. And so in 2001, the group that they went after first, in terms of their pathology, were non-British citizen Arabs. The group far more than anybody else that was targeted, right? So Jordanians, Iraqis, Moroccans, Algerians, they were picked up en masse and they were interned. Many people don't know this. No charge, no trial, no case. They were just arrested and they were sent off to Belmarsh. alhamdulillah, it was challenged in the end after a couple of years. Legal challenges, the House of Lords, we used to have a House of Lords, it's now called the Supreme Court. They ruled at the time that this was completely unconstitutional, that you can't just intern people because they're Arabs and you're scared of them, right? Again, a lot of people don't know that happened in the early years of the War on Terror, but it's exactly what did happen. And in the end, they had to let them go. Some of these people were then put under what's known as control orders. They were kept at home. After 2005, what happened? A new pathology arose, right? Because the guys that were involved in 7/7 were who? Were predominantly British-born Pakistanis. And so after that, British-born Pakistanis became surveilled at a rate that they had never been before. To the extent that Jay Johnson, who was the director of Homeland Security in America at the time, said that it was advising the Bush administration to have a special immigration procedure just for British-born Pakistanis. That if you were born in the UK, but you hailed from Pakistan, if you wanted to go to America, you would have had an entirely different visa system. Fortunately, good lawyers in America, they, alhamdulillah, they shut that down before they could even start. But it just showed you like the way in which, because of one incident, a whole community got otherized, okay? 2007, Ethiopia invades Somalia. What do we know next? MI5 and the police are harassing and targeting the Somali community in the UK, even though like the conflict had nothing to do with the UK, but they were worried about tensions, and so they start getting profiled. And then, of course, after the Arab Spring, so many people from the Middle East became targeted. So I wanted to give you an idea about the way these pathologies work. They're based on fears that wider society have. They fear us, and therefore they develop policies that then institute that fear further at a legal and policy level. But there is a piece of legislation that affects all of us equally in its discrimination, right? Regardless of where we come from. And unfortunately, this is Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000. So this is a piece of legislation that actually predates 9/11, but mostly it's been used after 9/11, of course. This is the power that allows them to stop you at an airport. Now, when they stop us, right, and it's predominantly Muslims, okay, and we're talking about in the tens of thousands every single year, why do they stop us? They stop us because of, again, the pathology, the superficial, the things that they can see up front, which include what? Our skin color, of course. It includes our names. It includes the clothes that we wear. It includes whether or not we have a hijab on or whether or not we have a beard. And so all of these things come, but it also the pathology includes what? The destinations we travel back from. If we come back from Europe, we're far less likely to be stopped than if we come from Western Europe, than if we come back from, say, for example, Bangladesh or Pakistan or Morocco or Algeria, Tunisia, Palestine, or wherever, right? Far more likely to be stopped if we come from any of these countries. If you come from Bosnia, you're more likely to be stopped. It's Europe, but there is Europe and then there's Europe, right? And so even in that, there are distinctions that are made in terms of how we are stopped. Now, they don't care ultimately whether or not you're Sufi, Salafi, Deobandi, Ikhwani, Brelwi, whatever sect, even if you're Shia or the different strands of Shiism, they don't care. That's not what they're looking for initially, right? Now, they may change their approach once they find out what you are, but ultimately they don't care. The reason you're stopped in the first place is because of a superficial reason. Now, some of you be like, well, you know, they've got a job to do and, you know, Muslims have been mostly at fault for this and whatever, right? But you have to look at the consequences of these things. Now, what do they do when they stop you? Do they ask you, the legislation says that they are allowed to ask you questions, you know, that you are obliged to answer under law, right? To do with whether or not you've been involved with the preparation, instigation, and there was one more thing, of an act of terrorism or commission of an act of terrorism. These three things: preparation, instigation, or commission of an act of terrorism. Now, I could go outside my house right now. I could take a gun or a baseball bat and I could kill somebody in the street, and I would have more rights to stay silent than I do at an airport stop. At an airport stop, I have no rights. They can take my phone. They can demand my phone's password to it. They can ask me any question that they like, and if I say I refuse to answer that question, I will be charged with having committed a terrorist offense. What are the questions that they ask me usually? I've been stopped a few times. They'll ask me things like, are you a practicing Muslim? Do you go to the mosque and pray? Which mosque do you go to pray? What do you think about the Israel-Palestine conflict? And these questions are asked to tens of thousands of Muslims each year. So if you're one of those who says that, well, I've never been stopped, the chances are, if you fly regularly, you will be stopped at some point in the future and you will be asked these questions. Now, the question that I always ask back to them, rather than answering their question, is always, what does this have to do with whether or not I have been involved in the commission, preparation, or instigation of an act of terrorism, right? And that's usually a way of trying to stop them from invading into my personal thoughts and beliefs, because I'm obliged legally to answer their question. I have to by law. If I don't, then I will be arrested and convicted of an act of terrorism, even though it's not an act of terrorism to do this. So what are they doing here? They're trying to build their database around Muslim beliefs and ideas. Because again, what they do is not only pathologize our external features, but also what's inside our minds. And so they keep this data in order to understand better. And you might think that you're a doctor, right? Like a medical doctor, not a fake doctor like me, right? And you might think that, I'm living a good life. It's got nothing to do with me. I've got nothing to hide. Well, the actor Riz Ahmed, the one that's been in Star Wars, The Russian Fundamentalist, many TV shows. I'm sure many of you know him. You would think that he would be safe from this too. No, definitely not. And Riz Ahmed speaks he writes beautifully about his experience in a book called The Good Immigrant. He's got a chapter in that book. It's by Nikesh Shukla. I very much recommend reading his experience of being stopped at the airport. But, you start to see how the structure of Islamophobia works within this one airport stop. What this represents in terms of the state's relationship with us as Muslims. Brother Naim, please do feel free to give me any notice in terms of time, because I don't want to overrun, especially Dr. and Professor Salman's going to be, I'm sure, an amazing presentation. And
so I'll do that.
Yes, thank you. And so, that is just one aspect of terrorism legislation. Now, what is terrorism legislation used for predominantly, right? And some of you might rightly say, well, it's used for terrorism, of course. And, you would be correct in assuming that that should be the case. But the reality is it's not. And I'm going to explain how. When a violent act occurs in the UK, such as Michael Adebolajo beheading the Soldier League Rigby on the streets, or the fertilizer bomb plot, where the police prosecuted individuals for trying to blow up the Ministry of the club, the Ministry of Sound, or the airline bomb plot, or any number of actual plots that took place or attempted to take place. What did they prosecute these men under? It wasn't terrorism legislation. They were all convicted predominantly. There might have been one or two small pieces of legislation here and there for small acts, but the main act of violence or intended violence was prosecuted under legislation that predated 9/11, whether it was the Offences Against Persons Act or it was the Fire and Explosives Act. So what is terrorism legislation used for? It's used exactly in the type of scenario that I've described already, where you have an airport stop, or you could have in your possession a document. Some of you remember the famous case of Samina Malik, who was known as the lyrical terrorist. She was writing some poetry down. I mean, some people might say, well, that's quite risque poetry, right? But at the end of the day, it's poetry, right? Like, nobody's going around banning extremely violent opera, and opera is extremely violent to the nth degree, right? Nobody's going around banning other forms of kind of predominantly white culture. But she was prosecuted and convicted at the time. It was overturned on appeal, but convicted at the time for what? For writing poetry. Ahmed Faraz, prosecuted for selling books. What were the books that he was selling? Not like how do you blow up the Western world, for Sayyid Qutb's milestones, right? Now, whether or not you agree with Sayyid Qutb, it doesn't make a difference. You know, the point is that he is somebody who has contributed to the development of Islamic thought since, you know, since he passed away in the early 60s. What did the government argue in that case? It's interesting because it's important to understand how the government thinks about these things. They did, in their mind, an act of like kind of causation. They said that there are X number of people who have attempted to commit acts of terrorism in the UK. 70% of those people had a copy of Sayyid Qutb's milestones on their book. Ipso facto, you know, that book is linked to terrorism. Now, you know, for any sociologist who's even worth, you know, any of the letters in any of their decrees will tell you that is not the right data set. The right data set is look at every single person in history since the 1950s, when Sayyid Qutb wrote milestones, up until the present day. How many of those people have committed acts of political violence around the world since they read that book? The number now drops to an infinitesimal amount. Like, you cannot quantify it, it is that small, right? Because the book is sold in its millions around the world since the 50s up until now. And so you start to understand, oh, right, the government skews data, it skews the way in which it presents facts in order to reach certain conclusions. This is part of a structure of Islamophobia that we have in the UK. And so you see that when the government says we have convicted X number of people of terrorism crimes, what they're saying is we have convicted X number of people for non-violent offenses. It's very important we remember that, okay? It's because of the way that it's caged by the media, these statistics gives a perception that we are under threat much more than we actually are. We're not really under threat that much. I can see somebody's asking a question about Prevent. I don't know if I have time to go into Prevent right now, but Brother Naeem, if you don't mind me just sharing my screen for a moment, is that possible?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Sagir Bhai, can you...
I just want to show you one graphic that I produced.
Yeah. Sagir Bhai, can I ask you to do that, please?
Let's see. Okay, there we go. All right. I just want to show you this image. Can you see that okay? So this is a map that I produced called the Counter-Terrorism Matrix. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing right now, okay? But it's a chapter in a book called What is Islamophobia by Nazanin Massoumi. So the book's called What is Islamophobia? It's published by Pluto Press. But my chapter in that book really focuses on the ways in which different pieces of legislation interlink with one another in order to constantly reinforce this idea that Muslims are a threat, okay? And all of this is done just on the basis of suspicion and not actual fact. So somebody somewhere has a suspicion about somebody based on their beliefs, based on their ideas. They go into the system and the system reinforces itself until it makes you a threat. So I'm just going to stop sharing that. And, you know, I think I've already gone way beyond the 20 minutes that I was allotted. So perhaps I'll be able to bring up Prevent and talk a little bit about that in the Q&A, because obviously there's a lot to talk about there. But, you know, Jazakumullah khair, inshallah, I hope that was helpful just to kind of give you an introduction into a way that, you know, structural racism works in terms of Islamophobia, especially through counterterrorism legislation.
Thank you, Jazakallah khair. Has Professor Salman joined Sagir? Zahirka? No matter. I think what we'd like to do is, if it is all right with you, there are a few questions that we'd like to ask and for you to continue. Now, I'm sure you've heard of this very interesting book called I Refuse to Condemn Terrorism. It's a very interesting title for the book that was written by yourself. And I'm very keen to understand every time there is a vocal, articulate, expressive, conscientious Muslim in the public space, the pressure on them when they highlight Islamophobia, on having to condemn, is quite substantial. And the argument for it is very, very persuasive. Your title hits that very, very, very hard. If one were to ask you, why do you refuse? Perhaps the way that I've asked the question is leading and also incorrect, but it is a natural question that
Sure.
quite a lot of activists face, and maybe it'll help us understand not only the background, not only the premise, but actually the right answer to that.
Okay, so my immediate Jazakumullah khair for the question. So the book isn't just mine. I'm just the editor of the book. So I write the introduction, but the book is 18 other activists and scholars who write about their experience, and not just as Muslims, but also as Black people who are constantly asked to condemn their communities as well. So there's a couple of non-Muslims in there as well who write about their experience in very similar ways than we experience it.
Yeah.
I think the appropriate question is, why is the demand to condemn terrorism so important? And who is it important for, right? So there's 90 people, 90 participants in this group chat.
Yeah.
For all of us, we would say that between us, there's no demand. There's no necessity for us to explain ourselves to one another. We're all Muslims. We're all perfectly comfortable with one another in terms of, we give each other that husna dhan, that benefit of the doubt that we are decent human beings, that we are decent Muslims who want to live a decent, ethical Islamic life, right? So we have that benefit of the doubt for each other. When that demand is made, usually the people who are making that demand are white people. Let's be honest, that's predominantly who's making that demand of us. Why are they making that demand? What purpose does it serve for them? The purpose it serves for them is that it reinforces for them this idea that we do not present an existential threat to their existence, that we are not here to harm them. What is coded in that demand as well, though, what is coded alongside it is this idea that we do not belong, right? So even though my English is at, alhamdulillah, a level that compares to many others, I would say, perhaps some might suggest even better than the majority of society, it doesn't make a difference. Even though I intonate and gesticulate and I'm as sarcastic as any other British person in exactly the same tone that they are sarcastic in, the fact that my popular culture references are almost entirely the same as theirs. When I talk about only fools and horses, they know exactly what I'm talking about. The fact that I'm not kind of referring to Punjabi humor when I'm speaking to English people. All of these things are markers of where belonging is for us, right? What makes us part of the communities and the societies that we live in, this recognition of one another. What even, when you go abroad or even go out of London, I'm a Londoner, and you're coming home, you start seeing signs for London, and that kind of sakina enters your heart, right? You feel it, right? That's how you know what home is. When sakina enters your heart, you feel that peace of, like, finally, my own bed, my own home. We're denied that in these moments. We're denied any humanity beyond our locus to another person based on a general notion of a faith that's shared by 1.7 billion people. And in the denial of that exists the racism that harms our communities. That's where the racism rests, in the denial of humanity. What they're saying to us is that, look, we want to believe you're human just like we are, but could you please just confirm your humanity for us before we engage with you further. If you can't do that, we're afraid that we can't see you in the same moral light that we see ourselves. And therefore you are excluded from grace. You're excluded from goodness, right? Now, of course, we take izzah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That's how we view ourselves. That's how we view our inshallah, I hope that we all do, that we see honor and dignity coming from the divine, right? But we're human beings as well at the end of the day. We deserve some degree of dignity in this life too. And so we are denied that when this demand for condemnation takes place. And of course, we are free to condemn our own community as much as possible, providing we don't condemn the violence of the state. Now, if we condemn the violence of the state, then that is a problem. And obviously, many of you all know this already, but Martin Luther King, one of the most profound statements that he makes, and this was taught to him not by no one other than his own wife, Coretta Scott King, right? She doesn't get enough credit, but she was the radical before Martin Luther King was the radical. She's the one who taught him about, what takes place around the world and connecting it, what takes place domestically, and so he learned from her that he could not raise his voice against the violence of what was going on by his own community in America until he had raised his voice against the violence of what America was doing in Vietnam, right? And what did he call America? The greatest purveyor of violence in the world, right? And so we're left with this moment, right, where we, as 1.7 billion people, are having this constant demand made for us. You must condemn the violence of this person here. And when we raise the issue of the extreme violence of war, of bombs, of economic sanctions, we're then told that we're apologists for terrorism. And so you see the duality of the way in which this works, right? We are simultaneously condemned for not condemning and condemned for condemning too at the same time.
That's a very, very difficult position. But can I ask you, perhaps it is our reading of history. So there was a time where, let's say, the Jewish community was facing extreme persecution. They were demonized and otherized. Suddenly, any talk of Europe is referred to as the Christo-Judeo civilization, where you had a community that was otherized and demonized suddenly becoming accepted the mainstream. They still do face a lot of anti-Semitism and institutional structural anti-Semitism. We've also seen quite a lot after the civil rights movement. I think it is unfair to say that after the civil rights movement, everything turned out very well for the Black community in the US. But however, the ability for them to raise their voice against systemic and sustained state-sponsored racism is now much stronger through popular culture and all of that. Are we being naive in being hopeful that Islamophobia will also be seen as a scourge like racism, which it is, like anti-Semitism, which it is, and therefore we will start seeing a backlash against this, and there will be attempts to make some penance for these sins?
Look, I'm forever the optimist, alhamdulillah, and that's largely because I genuinely believe in the promises that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes to us, that after hardship there is always ease, right? What I don't put my stock in is my ability to see that change in my life. The only thing I place stock in is my duty to do what I can with the rizq that I've been given, right? Like I have been given a certain rizq in my life, a provision in my life that's to do with not just what my earning is, right? That's a very capitalist notion of rizq, right? Rizq is everything, it includes our intellect. And so I don't place my stock in material change. I place it in ethics. How are we as Muslims acting and behaving ethically towards the problems that we see in society? And if we're not acting ethically towards those things, then ultimately, we all have one single grave, right? We all have one encounter with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately that we have to be answerable for. And if our answer to the injustices that we see in the world, is less than adequate, then I think that's something that we have to worry about. You know, look, do you think that we, especially those of us in the West who are living in the West, are going to be accounted in the same way as, say, a fisherman off the coast of Somalia or a farmer in Afghanistan? I would suggest not. I think that considering what we have been given, the burden to help the oppressed becomes elevated. And so we might be in an extremely privileged position, but that privilege comes with extreme burdens as well. And we don't pay enough attention to those burdens. And so for me, the ultimate goal of changing society for the better fits in with a larger Quranic injunction to always do right. Like when Shu'aib alayhi salam was told to go to his people, you know, what was he correcting? Correcting the corruptness of the marketplace, of the way in which the market operates, the cheating that was going on. You know, we have to be like him. We have to say that we can't secularize. And what's their argument back to him? They say to him, what has the market got to do with prayer? Right? They're punished for making that argument. You know, in the same way, like we secularize our faith so much that we get lost in this idea of material change. If we're not bringing about material change, then what is the purpose of what we're doing? That is a very capitalist notion. It's rooted to the idea that that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will judge us in the end by what we achieve. No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will judge us by what we attempt and how much we connect what we're doing to having taqwa of him and the world that we live in. And so that's why I find those difficult questions really difficult to answer, because I really don't believe in this idea.
I mean, it wasn't like I know I'm being shameless in saying that, but I wasn't looking at, and apologies, I was asking you to look at this crystal ball and tell me, well, is it going to get better for
Inshallah,
us, or is it going to be much
always
worse?
Get better. Inshallah, I think.
All right,
that,
fine. Well, it gives us. We're optimistic. So on that very same note, you know, I'm trying to think of, you know, you've mentioned about Muslims being stereotyped and how others are being, you know, racially profiled in public spaces. What is it that we can do individually and collectively? One, to help ourselves, and also to either put up a mirror and show why this is wrong, or explain why you've got this whole thing completely out of order.
Sure. So there's a couple of things, right? First of all, I think all of us have to like do a muhasaba, like a self-reflection about what kind of skills that we have, and then think about, okay, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me these skills, what am I supposed to use them for? And then see if I can be involved in using those skills to bring about some of the structural changes I want to see, whether it's by involving myself with organizations like Cage or Mend, or if your interest is in Palestine with Friends of Al-Aqsa, or many other organizations out there, right, who are already doing work. Let's not replicate, let's join with one another to do these things, right? But, you know, ultimately, you know, it's not about joining one specific thing that exists. It's about really trying to hold on to this idea that, you know, self-accounting for what we're doing with our time on earth is really the most important thing. That if we don't do that, then really, you know, what are we here for? What are we trying to achieve? Where are we getting lost in the process? I think that there are so many wonderful organizations out there that we can join hands with. I think we should always be in a process of trying to work with other Muslims. You know, ultimately, you know, divide and rule. It's a cliche, but it's a tactic that's worked very, very, very well for hundreds of years. You know, if anything for thousands of years. I always call Iblis the world's oldest anthropologist. You know, he's got humans figured out very, very well. He's got tens of thousands of years of, you know, kind of understanding human behavior, knowing how to mess with us, knowing what our frailties are, and he's very good at exploiting them. But one of the things that Iblis loves most is divisions, you know, and divisions not just between communities, but even just between, like, in households, or between a husband and wife, right? That's his modus operandi. And when you know what his modus operandi is, then you know the panacea to that is to come together, is to try and meet one another in ways that breach that fear. What keeps us apart from one another is ultimately fear. Is fear that the state might do something to us to harm us. But that is the fear that we have to push past. Because if we don't, then we're just going to be constantly stuck in this idea that it's not me, it's them. Like the state is only targeting them. And we see how policy shifts. Look at France. France is the perfect example of that. If you want to study Islamophobia, just study France. You know, it's really, it's getting to the stage of the Spanish Inquisition. If you look at Matthew Carr's book, Blood and Faith, the Purging of Muslim Spain, like every single thing that the French are doing right now is exactly what they did then. Like to the extent that Ferdinand and Isabella, they write letters to one of the priests, and Matthew Carr recounts this story where they're saying that the al-malfa, which was their word for the niqab, is a barrier to integration. They're literally using this language, which props up again 500 years later, you know, in France. It's no coincidence, you know. As I said before, these things run in cycles, and you know, oppression works very, very well because oppressors know how to keep fair against minority communities.
Okay. Dr. Asim, I just want to let you know that, you know, we've been unable to connect with Professor Salman Sayyid yet. But what we, if you recall, at the very beginning when we did want to continue the session, we'd like to ask if Prevent actually perpetuates Islamophobia. I mean, given the context that you've given about how the accusation of being an apologist and the insistence on actually taking the burden of actually condemning acts of violence. So does Prevent actually perpetuate Islamophobia?
Absolutely. I mean, Prevent in its essence is a racist and Islamophobic policy, and you know, we know this because ultimately the vast majority of the people that it impacts are Muslims. And I'm going to go through some of the data shortly, inshallah. But if you look at, for example, what Amber Rudd, she admitted to as Home Secretary, she said, we get the intelligence more from Prevent. It's not about policing so much as engaging with community leaders in this area. So what was she admitting to here? She was effectively saying that the way that we do intelligence gathering of the community is through using the community itself, right? So they've already otherized us. They've already seen us as a threat. And what they want to do is do this soft form of intelligence gathering. And the way that they do that is through funding. So how do they get acquiescence for Prevent? And so for those of you who don't know what Prevent is a program in the UK that attempts to draw people away from radicalization. Okay, that's how it's presented, at least anyway, right? Except the vast majority of the people that impacts, as I said already, are Muslim. And why is that the case? So in 2015, we had something called the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act come into place. What this piece of legislation did is that it made it mandatory on every single public body in the UK to ensure that those under their care, whether doctors, nurses, dentists, school teachers, academic lecturers, to stop those under their care being drawn into radicalization, right? Kept terms very, very, very vague. It doesn't say specifically prevent, but the vast majority, like 99%, of public sector workers will use the Prevent policy. What does this achieve, right? You tell people that this is about stopping people from becoming radicals. What they then do is that they internalize the information that they've been given, and then they project it on the communities that are in front of them. So what happens to a Muslim child when your teacher is being told to stop radicalization? Your teacher reads The Sun and the Daily Mail. Your teacher reads the statements of Boris Johnson calling women in niqabs letterboxes and this, that, and there. You see Zach Goldsmith running an Islamophobic campaign against his opposition for the mayoral race. You see almost every single media outlet constantly vilifying Muslims. Even with COVID, haven't you noticed how almost every single news article about COVID has hijabi women as the main picture when they're doing the articles, right? All of this seeps into the psyche of the public. So the two most loved newspapers in this country are also the two most racist, the Daily Mail and the Sun, right? They're the most read. They're the ones that set the tone for how we are seen. And so when we're vilified at the top level, this filters through to the public. Now the public are asked, after all this vilification process, to make an assessment of how dangerous we are. They've already had the narrative. So how does that narrative express itself? Expresses itself through these referrals that take place. So in 2015, 2016, there were almost 8,000 referrals to Prevent. 95% of them were false referrals, okay? Now, so Prevent come along and they do this regularly in the public eye. They'll say, hey, look, we've got just as many far right referrals as we do Muslim referrals. It's 50-50 in terms of percentage. Again, this is why we have to do like data work. This is why just simple academic exercises are so important. If we take 1,000 cases, 50% is 500. 500 out of a population of 3 million Muslims. The other 50% of 500 come from a population of 50 million non-Muslims, white non-Muslims, right? So now you start to see, okay, so as a ratio, okay, now let's look at the likelihood of a Muslim child being referred, and it skyrockets. So we are being referred at a much higher rate than non-Muslims, almost 1 to 50. When you see it in those terms, rather than just the numbers of individuals who have been referred, you then get an idea that that 50% of Muslim referrals comes only from a population of 3 million. It means we are being discriminated at a rate that is unbelievable. And people think, well, what's the harm of a referral? I'll tell you what the harm is. Imagine it's your child who's taken out of a classroom by a counter-terrorism officer and asked about his opinions about the conflict in the Middle East. Do you think that child's opinion of the authorities will ever be the same again? And this was this is an actual case. This was a 7-year-old child whose case we were working on, right? Who was taken out of the classroom without the parents' consent, without the parents being present, and being quizzed about his beliefs on a political situation that not even grown adults have really thought about in too much concrete detail, right? But this is how we're pathologized. Or another child, I think it was a 10-year-old, who was asked to recite verses from the Quran and had non-Muslim police officers do tafsir of those verses, explaining why they were so dangerous. That's an actual case. Go on Prevent Watch's website. It's another organization called Prevent Watch, and look up the Quran case. You will see for yourself how they treated this child. Our interactions with the state are never the same again. This is what we call violence. And while it's not violence in the sense of having your face punched in by a brutalizing police officer, it's violence in the sense that you do not come away unscathed from that interaction. And even with airport stops, we never come unscathed away from these interactions. And that's why when we minimize the impact, the long-term trauma of these incidents, what we do is we minimize the harm that we're experiencing. And the one thing that the government has never done with any counter-terrorism legislation, with any policies, with any of these discriminatory policies, is do a long-term impact assessment on our collective mental health of being subjected to these profiling policies. And my concern is that we won't see the impacts of these now as much as we will 10, 15, 20 years from now, when our children grow up in a world where they have only ever felt like they were other, like that there was a different set of rules that were applicable to them than anybody else. Sorry, Brother Naeem, are you frozen?
Okay, Naeem?
I think his internet might be frozen.
I guess his internet has been frozen. We had another question in the meantime. So Brother Salam is asking, instead of refusing to condemn an atrocity, irrespective of Muslim or not, wouldn't it be better to condemn both sides in the same breath? That is the atrocity and the state, which is perhaps the causation.
Sure. I mean, look, I'm not being prescriptive here. I think every single moment requires its own specific response. You know, the book I Refuse to Condemn, what it's really speaking about is those moments where a demand is made for us. Look, we condemn terrorism all the time, in the sense that when I go to the masjid, and in particular in Ramadan, more so than in any other moment, right? When you're around a lot of young people in particular who are interested in various ideas, you know, I get constantly asked about ISIS, about Al-Qaeda, you know, and I constantly sit them down and I will sit there for an hour even to explaining who these actors are, why their theology is incorrect, why their political analysis is incorrect, while their methodology is incorrect. And I will go through with indeed, I don't infantilize the children in our masajid. I sit down with them and I explain to them in detail why these things are wrong. Because I'm a Muslim who has a relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I have a qiyamah that I have to answer for. Like, if I'm in that moment, I have a responsibility to educate and nurture these children. I don't require the prevent strategy to give me money to say, de-radicalize these children. I don't do it for that reason. I do it because it's the right thing to do as a Muslim, right? So what I'm talking about in books like I Refuse to Condemn is the demand. When the demand is made from somebody outside of our community, and that demand is attached to this idea that we somehow are subhuman until we prove otherwise, I think it's dangerous for us to normalize that kind of behavior. Because if we do, we say to them that you have every right to ask us this question, and they really don't. They have no right to ask this question whatsoever, because we never ask that question back, because we are people who are fair and just. That is a crucial difference. I did not go around pointing out white people, white men in the streets, and asking them whether or not they were like Jimmy Savile. I can tell you that right now. I never bothered doing that because I'm a just person. I like to try and be just, at least anyway. I don't blame other people for the mistakes of individuals. I don't blame whole societies for the mistakes of individuals. I might have a critique of modernity.
Is it the risk of being binary, where refusal to condemn is seen as condoning it? Is that the problem?
Well, they explicitly say that. That's part of the problem. They actually say, well, if you don't condemn, then you must condone, right? And that's
so it's like you're with us or against us, right? Thing.
Absolutely. And they're the ones who are establishing that binary, not us. What we're saying is that that question isn't relevant to us because we have no reason to answer it, because we grieve, we hurt, we are affected by these things just as much as anybody else. Muslims are killed more by terrorism than anybody else. But when our lives are taken, they are never given the same type of precedence that the lives of others are. And so we see even in that a hypocrisy. When the Peshawar school attack happened, I didn't see world leaders flying off to Peshawar to hold hands and give condolences and whatever, right? Because, you know, there's just an assumption that brown lives and black lives are taken in violent circumstances every single day, and therefore they do not require that level of support and encouragement. You know, and this is a reality. We have to be fair about, you know, the way in which we are perceived. We shouldn't, you know, I believe that we shouldn't just give them a pass over the racist ways in which they otherize us constantly. And that's why I think it's important for us to really push back. And that's what this book was about. This book was, you know, trying to say, you've had it too good for too long in terms of how you've been treating us. And we're showing you very, very clearly why this is racist and why we won't take it anymore either. And, you know, alhamdulillah, it's been very heartwarming to hear back from people who are already reading the book, you know, saying that they finally felt like they had been seen, that they recognized their experiences very intimately. And the essays have been written in a very intimate way too.
Yeah.
Not academic, and I really wanted to get that across, that we experience these things as human beings, not in an academic way. Like the result of that question has a human impact upon our lives, and you need to understand what that is. And so inshallah, I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts it, inshallah, has some impact.
One last question, if I may, Doctor. I mean, this was and this is something that quite a lot of us, I know you've said it in ways, but we're a young, when I say young, we're a relatively young immigrant community. The Malayali Muslims, we're mostly first generation and second generation, which means we continue to fly back to see our parents and our extended family. So the risk that you talk about is very real for us. And we would like to know, what is it that any of us should do if we are actually stopped at the airport and being subject to this? What is it that, we're asking for a practical tip as the last question.
Sure. I mean, I think, don't try not to be a victim in that situation. They look at the legislation. They're allowed to ask you about whether or not you've been involved in the commission, preparation, or instigation of act of terrorism. I think it's really important that we force them to stick to a line of questioning that sticks to that. When they start to stray outside of the boundaries of that investigation line, then I think, we really need to sit back and say, hold on a second, okay? What has that question got to do with, your specific line of inquiry? Like, it doesn't, asking me about whether or not I pray at the mosque doesn't tell you about whether or not I've been involved in an instigation, preparation, or commission act. And when you push them enough and you say, well, why do you think the two things are connected? They'll say, well, it's because, like, people connect Muslims to terrorism. And in that, they expose their own racism, right? What they're saying to you is, just because you are a Muslim, we are connecting you to a wider genus of violent actions that are taking place. And I think it's important that you get them to that point where they admit that, and then say to them, well, I don't think it's really appropriate for you to equate a religion that's practiced by 1.7 billion people with, the acts of a very few individuals. If all of us were like that, right, the world would be in a much more messy place than it is, trust me. Like the reason why there isn't more terrorism is because, alhamdulillah, Muslims largely care about their akhirah. They largely care about their relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The reason why there isn't more is because we're decent people, who have a faith that really helps to instruct them. So I think it's important that we really try our best not to simply just kowtow to all of the questions that they ask. It's an intelligence gathering exercise. The less you give them, the better it is for you in the long term, because everything that you say will be kept on a record about you. And remember, in a racist system, you may say something that seems perfectly reasonable to you, but you don't know how a racist understands that piece of information, right? Yeah. And so don't just give, your life up thinking that everybody is as reasonable as you are, because that's part of the problem with racism. People aren't, because racism clouds everything. Look at Iblis. Iblis was around the angels, he was around the heavens, he was around Allah, and still he said, that, I'm better than him, about Adam alayhi salam. That's literally the words that he used. I'm made of fire and he's made of clay. Like, you can't get a more racist argument than that. Logic goes out of the window with racism.
True. True.
And so it's important we remember that.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a raised hand. It's been me who's been trying to collate the questions asked. So can I please ask him to go with your question, please? I can't identify the name of the person who's raised.
Shakil.
Shakil?
Assalamu alaikum. My name's Zuni and I'm from Leicester. I'm a secondary school student, and I just wanted to share my experience with you, something that happened at school. Basically, a couple of weeks ago, like probably last month, we had a friend. I had this like close friend called Ishmael, and he was taken out of class, and some of the teachers asked him if he was part of an armed weapons group. And he came in and he told like our class and stuff, like our friends and stuff, and then we were all like really confused and wondered why they said that. And then like a couple of days later, something like the exact same thing happened. Like they took him out of class again and they asked him the same question, but this time he said there was like a person there, like a guard or whatever, something like that, and he was really upset. And when he came out, he was like crying and stuff, and we were all concerned. So then we asked like our tutor about it, and we asked why they did something like that, and we like gave our thoughts and opinions and stuff like that. And then the next day we actually wrote a letter like explaining everything, and we wanted to give it to them, but they called us out to like explain everything. And this teacher, she was like trying to cover her tracks, and she was like, oh, like they asked us separately what happened, like what we thought. And then I asked her why she would ask a question like that to a child like that. Like it's quite rude, and he obviously took it to heart. And she was like, oh, never in my life have I ever said anything like that, and I've never heard anything like that. And she was like trying to cover her tracks and everything. And obviously none of us believed it or anything, but yeah. And I just wanted to like ask you what your advice is, and like if the person was like a prevent officer or anything like that.
For a start, Zuni, thank you so much for sharing that. It takes a lot of bravery to share these experiences, and I really admire the fact that you didn't just simply take it. You saw somebody else in distress, and you took action, and you're my hero of the day. Really, I can only say that. May Allah bless you, bless your family. Because we find too many bystanders these days, people who aren't willing to stand up for those who are feeling upset, feeling hurt, feeling distressed. And it means a great deal to me to know that there are young people like you, like out there like you, who are really gonna, inshallah, take this world forward in ways that maybe we failed you. In terms of advice, it sounds like it was a prevent intervention that was taking place. I can't obviously say specifically because I don't know enough details about it, but it does very much seem like something that they were trying to intervene in this young man's life in a way that was inappropriate. With these things, it's always good to contact an organization like Cage or Prevent Watch to log the concern. They can put you in touch with lawyers who would then help to write letters to the school in order to start a formal line of questioning about how something like that took place. And the paper trail is extremely important, right? Because what happens when we have conversations in person with teachers or with the headmasters and headmistresses or whatever else, they're able to just simply like bat away the concerns by pretending nothing actually happened. But when you get another organization involved, what happens is that we can then record what these incidents are, and also then explain to the school in real ways how this left somebody distressed in a very, very real way. I'm sure that young man probably won't feel the same about his teachers now. And that's and remember, this is something that we are now talking about, but there are literally thousands of other young people who are going through this, who don't have those avenues, who feel isolated, feel alone. And sometimes people like you, Zuni, don't have the bravery and the courage to stand up for them. So I would definitely recommend Ishmael's parents potentially lodging a complaint with the school. They can get help, as I said, from Prevent Watch or from Cage to help do that if they like, or if they know lawyer friends, they can potentially do that themselves. But I think it is important that we log these instances when they occur. So really, mashallah, you really made my day hearing about your own role in that. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you always.
Zoni, you're going to be on our next webinar on Islamophobia, if it's all right.
That's it. I'm done. I'm done.
No. On that very special note, I think it's on that very good note where, like we said earlier, that should we be optimistic about the future, and to have someone like her, it takes, and I say it in the nicest of ways, it takes several boxes. Female, young, future, articulate, wanting to do, and definitely interested in everything that we want to do.